Hey, everybody. I wanted to do for you what's going to be a relatively brief lecture on the Old Testament, and I'm really going to focus on some sort of basic theological issues um, and talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we can differentiate the kind of monotheism we see in the Old Testament, and then eventually, when we get to the New Testament, we'll kind of refine that a little bit further. And paganism, which we're already familiar with from some of our previous readings. But some of the differences there I think are important. And I wanted to make sure that everybody had a pretty good grasp of those. And then I want to talk just a little bit about the Bible as text um, and interpretation of the Bible, etc. Um, as I'm sure many of you know, there are lots of different traditions of interpretation of the Bible, just like there are different versions of the Bible. Um, and those different traditions of interpretation are sort of grounded in different processes for what's thought to be the best way of interpreting the Bible. That sometimes can lead to some rather different meanings and applications of the Bible as a text. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that as well. Um, so obviously, as we're moving into the Old Testament now, we're talking about monotheism, right? One divine being. Um, and I will help us again to contrast that a little bit with some of the pagan traditions that we've been dealing with. So I'm going to share screen a few things here with you that I hope you find helpful as far as that goes. Um, so first here, um, and these are just some things I found on the internet that I thought you might find sort of helpful here. In looking at, for example, the origins of science, and as this kind of suggests, there are elements in the origins of science, even though we think of science in a modern context as secular, certainly influenced by belief systems that predated science, right? I mean, if you read some of the great empiricist writers, you can see that they still make references to the divine, etc. So I'm not going to try and pretend that those things are completely incompatible. I think um, there are ways and perspectives from which there are incompatibilities, certainly, and I think that's important to recognize those. But nonetheless, I think it's problematic to assume that kind of empirical science as a tradition and different religious traditions, including things like Christianity, um, developed independently of each other, because that's obviously not the case. And you can even see relationship between paganism and science that I traced a little bit in looking at Aristotle and calling him a proto-scientist, kind of an early scientist in his attitude towards things, and the kind of empiricism that we see in Aristotle. So I think it's important to kind of recognize that. But if we want to make some of the helpful distinctions here on the pagan side, right, we see um, in the traditions we've been talking about many gods, right? We're talking about Greek mythology. We'll be talking about Roman mythology a little later on. We read Virgil's Aeneid. Um, Many of the gods are the same in Roman and Greek mythology, though they have different names. And some of the stories associated with them are a little different. I'll actually share with you when we read Virgil a document that lists the different gods, Roman gods versus Greek gods, and you can see some of the names. You'll find you're familiar with some of the Roman names probably and some of the names for the Greek gods, but they are similar. You can also find that document yourself if you just go under files and look at the Virgil file. Christianity, we have either the Trinity. We think of that emphasized especially in the Catholic tradition, and a God who was transcendent, right? Transcendent is a really important term here. I recommend looking up transcendent in the Perry text. There's a good definition there. And again, I'll remind you that Perry's chapters 1 and 2 are the chapters that go along with our readings in the Old Testament and our discussion of Gilgamesh, which is another flood story that we're going to be doing on Wednesday, and I'll be doing a brief lecture that goes along with Gilgamesh. So please make sure to read Perry chapter 1 and 2. You already should have read Perry chapter 3 in our discussion of Greek philosophy and traditions. There also are PowerPoints for Perry chapter 1 and 2 that you should look over, review those, and at any point, again, always send me emails if you have questions. But the Perry text does do a nice job of treating this term transcendent, right? The idea of the divine is existing above and beyond in some way, right? And there are different ways of kind of formulating that. We see certain kinds of mysticism and animism in nature on the pagan side, where nature, even things that we typically think of as inanimate, are animate, and also that as well as nature sort of being living, also taking on human characteristics and traits, and also reflecting human emotions. You'll see that when you also look at romantic literature and the romantic traditions in philosophy, which have some links to paganism. And I know I've talked about romanticism a couple times, but the idea that a lot of the symbolism you'll see, for example, in romantic literature. I always read Frankenstein with my students and Hum too. And the moon will turn certain colors, or the wind will blow, or certain things will happen that will reflect kind of human emotions and things that are about to be happening. So this idea of the natural world just kind of being alive, and having certain kinds of human characteristics and divine characteristics at the same time. The Christian side, nature is rational. Again, you can see one of the links there in the origins of science. And of course, that is different in those different traditions, especially when we think about modern science, right? If we think about the rationality of nature within Christianity, it's tied to God, right? And to God is a rational, righteous, um, transcendent being who created nature. And that's the kind of rationality that's in nature and makes nature something we can understand, comes from that divine source. If we look at modern science, obviously we're thinking about evolutionary theory. We're thinking about all things having potentially evolved from some kind of initial, blob of protoplasm somewhere, and then taking different forms, et cetera. And so you don't see that same kind of notion of rationality as everything having been planned ahead of time that you see in the Christian sort of tradition. Phenomena, that means basic things that exist in the world. That's the plural. Phenomenon is the singular. So you'll see spirituality and spirits existing and the same human world with human beings. You see basic ideas of cause and effect coming out of the rationality on sort of the Christian side. Time is different. You'll see time viewed very much in cyclical kind of ways in paganism. The seasons, for example, and again, these early civilizations really depended on the seasons and understanding the seasons and gods being tied to the seasons, because they had to be thinking about agriculture. They had to be thinking about weather. They had to think about natural disasters and other kinds of things that might impact their lives. And that's true of people who were more agrarian, like the Spartans, or people who were more trade based, like the Greeks, and their ships and their navy. And that was also tied with the different cycles of time and with the stars, and being able to find your way using the stars, and also praying to the gods so that you wouldn't have bad weather while you're out in the water, right? That could be just as disastrous as having bad weather on the soil and destroying your crops. And then we have time as linear in the Christian side, kind of creation and consummation, kind of a movement of things to consummation, and more of an idea of linear time that you see in the Christian tradition. And of course, you can again see how several of those things on the right-hand side in this particular version of the worldviews, you can see, was obviously written to try and bring out some of the aspects of certain aspects of science, and especially earlier science, with the Christian tradition here. So we have Christian versus pagan there. I'm going to share another kind of version of this that brings out some different elements. Different ways to define pagan here. Nature worship, right? Worship of the immanent divine, which I'll talk about in a minute, and a kind of humanism. Idols, worshiping idols, right? Think about how important that is in our early Bible readings, especially in Exodus, right? When the people are worried that they're being led astray, um, and wanting to fall back on their traditional beliefs, right? Worshiping calves and other kind of idols. And typically, if you look at the idols that are things that people worship within the pagan tradition, they're idols of things that are really important, again, to their lives and their livelihood. And animals is obviously, would be a good example there. So we have the nature worship. Paganism includes both male and female gods. Again, we'll get into a little more specifically into the mythology when we get into Roman mythology in terms of gender and in terms of the relationship between gods and human beings. We'll see that traced out a little more directly. Again, when we read Virgil's Aeneid, which is the story of the founding of Rome, you'll see that it sort of combines Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. So there'll be some real similarities in the beginning of the book with Homer's Iliad, the story of Troy, and the story of the fall of Troy, which is kind of retold from the perspective of the Roman gods, but you'll see again those parallels. And then as the people of Troy are trying to find a new home for themselves after Troy falls, it roughly parallels the story of the Odyssey in Homer with the Greek gods. But of course, in Virgil, we get the Roman gods kind of version of that. We'll talk about demigods, people who are half human, half god, who are kind of torn between, those two realms, as it were. I don't want to push the two realms idea so hard because obviously in paganism, as over and against Christianity, we would want to emphasize that that these gods are not transcendent in the same way of existing above and beyond as as they are in Christianity versus paganism, when they're basically occupying the same realm. It's a larger realm, and we still can also think of those gods as existing, having their own existence and their own dwelling places, etc. But it's basically within the same world, if you will, as the human beings exist. Magical practice is obviously important within paganism. The efficacy of rituals having to, again, impacting the weather, rituals for rain, rituals tied to the seasons, rituals tied to warfare, certain rituals that you would undertake before you would undertake a big battle, for example. The corpus spirituality is sort of an interesting idea that this, again, whoever the individuals put this together, it's kind of emphasizing a kind of a practical spirituality, and that divine spark and that practical spirituality that ties in with this idea of the efficacy of rituals and of magical practice and wanting to appease the gods, keep the gods happy, for example. So the gods and humans as codependent and related, right? And again, that word immanent that you see again here, immanent divine as opposed to transcendent. And again, I'll go back to immanent here in a second, but remember, transcendent, it means existing above and beyond. Immanent means existing within, right? So the divine exists within nature, right? Which is why you see the worship of idols. You see people treating nature and different pagan traditions where if you kill an animal to eat, you'll say a prayer first. You'll thank that animal for giving up its life for you. so that you can have food to eat, or a clothing from the fur from that animal, from its coat, whatever it might be, um, because the divine exists within nature, right? Um, and you can see certain ideas of pagan, kind of, you might call ecology, growing out of that. Certainly with Native Americans and North American, you can see that. And a veneration of nature, right? Veneration here meaning reverence for nature, right? And having that kind of reverence, again, all that kind of ties in with this idea of the divine existing within nature. So to talk a little bit more about immanent here, there's some words that are related, that it's easy to confuse. So I just wanted to share this with you briefly. It says here words that are easily confused: eminent, imminent, and imminent. And you can see that they're kind of Latin roots on the top here. The two that were most important for us are what we were just talking about: immanent, remaining within or inherent in, right? The divine existing in nature, IMMANENT. And you need to keep that one straight with this other one over here, imminent, IMMINENT, which is something that's about to happen, impending, right? When they talk about something being imminent, there's a thunderstorm that's imminent, right? It's just about to happen. It's just around the corner. Make sure you keep that separate from immanent, which means existing within. And this is the word we're going to contrast with transcendent, right? Which means existing in some kind of another realm somewhere, transcendent, existing in another realm, existing without somewhere. Then there's also eminent, right? Something that's famous, lofty, esteemed is eminent. These are less likely to confuse: prominent, famous, permanent, remaining to the end, lasting, man or dwelling. But these two especially, you need to make sure to keep straight: imminent, something about to happen; immanent, remaining within or inherent, that we identify with paganism. So I just wanted to share that with you briefly. And then talk a little bit about tradition in terms of interpreting the Bible. There's a tradition of interpretation. It was first developed for biblical interpretation. There are different versions of it, and I'm talking about something here called hermeneutics, HERMENEUTICS, hermeneutics. And it basically is a kind of a theory of interpretation. Sometimes it's thought of as a science of interpretation. The only reason I hedge on that a little bit is there are lots of different kinds of traditions of hermeneutics and different kind of versions of hermeneutics, that calling it a science might be pushing a little too far there. But you'll sometimes see it as talked about as a science of interpretation. As I said, it was developed first for interpreting the Bible for a number of reasons. First of all, the Bible is an extremely complex text, right? And there are all kinds of events and people and stories in the Bible that refer to one another, right? There's places where there's overlap. There are places where you see the same stories told multiple times. We will, when we get to the New Testament, we read some of the Gospels, we'll see some examples of that. The Gospels being stories about the historical Jesus and the different relationships of people with Jesus, their stories about different events in Jesus' life told from their perspectives, the people who are the authors, obviously, of the Gospels. We typically think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the main ones. There were other Gospels that were actually discovered much later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we'll talk briefly about. But they will tell some of the same stories or the same events from a different perspective. So that's one reason that this kind of idea of developing a kind of a shared theory of interpretation of the Bible was thought to be important. And another reason is so that um, people could basically take the same ideas away from the Bible. Um, Traditionally, and this is not is much the case universally with theologians today, but traditionally the idea is there's one correct interpretation of the Bible, right? And if you want to find that one correct interpretation, if you can have a theory that will help you to interpret it, to discover that interpretation, right? And obviously that interpretation in the Old Testament is the Word of God, right? That if everybody's using the same kind of theory of interpretation, the same approach, therefore they will have the same interpretation, right? Interpretation is different from application. Their application of ideas from the Bible might be different. It might apply to their own place and time, right? And that's where some of the real complexity comes in theology and different arguments that people have over not interpretation of the Bible, but application of the Bible. Even even if you go back, many hundreds of years. Today, we not only have different applications of the Bible, but there are also different views about how to interpret the Bible correctly. So it will depend on kind of what tradition you're looking at and what kind of theology you're looking at, whether or not there's this idea of a specific interpretation, one right interpretation, where that comes from. For example, we'll get into a little bit more down the road here, the Protestant Reformation, right? And before the Protestant Reformation, you had, for example, the Catholic Church really holding to this idea of one correct interpretation of the Bible, and the Bible should be interpreted by officials from the church, right? And people should not try to interpret the Bible by themselves on their own. And there's a church hierarchy in the Catholic Church, right? And each with more authority in terms of being able to speak about the Bible. But there is the idea there pretty strongly, traditionally, with one interpretation. As we move to the Protestant Reformation, it's more the idea that individuals can develop their own relationship with God and read the Bible for themselves. So Bible reading becomes something that individuals and families do, right? Reading passages from the Bible every evening, or maybe before having a meal or something like that. So you see that certainly the church is still important in the Protestant tradition, but the home also becomes a place for spirituality, and for reading the Bible, discussing the Bible at a kind of a individual or family level in a way that's definitely different from within the Catholic Church tradition. And growing out of that Protestant Reformation and that tradition is when you start to see the idea of possible different interpretations of the Bible, right? You see the same thing when you look at the interpretation of literature. Some of you who might be English majors might be aware of different traditions historically of interpreting literature, and different approaches to interpretation being tied with the status of different interpretations. And again, traditional interpretation being what did the author intend? With the Bible, traditionally, it's what did God intend? Within literature, it's what did the author of that literature intend? And the idea was that there's one correct interpretation that one should try to decipher, and that was the intent of the author. That was a dominant perspective for a long time. It's not so dominant anymore. As other interpretations, other kind of interpretation theories developed, and as people started to realize, it's because how do you know what the author intended? That becomes really complicated. And as Freudian psychology comes along, and the role of the subconscious mind, and the relationship between the subconscious mind and creativity, and the idea that the subconscious mind and the unconscious mind are actually bigger than the conscious mind, is the idea that authors maybe don't necessarily know what they're saying, or they may intend something, but there might be something else coming out in what they're saying. That, of course, led to an explosion in literary criticism of different ways of interpreting texts and of different ideas coming out of texts, right? Whereas an author might, on the surface, be saying something, but under the surface, there might be things in their subconscious mind there that are, allow for other interpretations, other things that are actually what's motivating what they're saying, and it gets really complicated when you start going in that direction. And I just wanted to give you a sense for that as that developed historically. But obviously, for right now, we're going to be focusing on the Bible. The basic mechanism within hermeneutics as an interpretation tradition is what's called the hermeneutic circle. And this diagram is a version of the hermeneutic circle. And at the top of the diagram, you have the whole text in that one big circle. On the bottom, you have little circles, which are parts of that one whole text. So you can kind of see how this works, right? You start with the whole, you analyze the whole into its different parts, and then you resynthesize those parts back into the whole again. And this is the hermeneutic circle that you, in terms of the basic idea, as you read a text and you analyze and synthesize and analyze and synthesize, you enhance your understanding of the text. You're able to understand it better, right? And the idea is that you're analyzing the whole in terms of the parts and the parts in terms of the whole, right? You can certainly see how this would work in interpreting the Bible, right? If you want to understand any one passage in the Bible, you need to understand the larger context, right? The larger context is also made up of parts, however. So you go back and forth between part and whole, part and whole. And on some versions of the hermeneutic circle, it actually becomes kind of a spiral, with the idea that each time you go through the hermeneutic circle, your understanding becomes thicker, becomes richer. So you kind of spiral out each time you go through this kind of circular process. There's some really complicated versions of the hermeneutic circle. If you just search the internet, you can find some. I was trying to decide what to share with you for this lecture and chose something that's pretty straightforward here, but you'll see there are all kinds of versions, and you can see why people sometimes call it a science of hermeneutics, because it's been developed in some really complex ways. This is just kind of the basic hermeneutic circle for us here. Again, you can see why this would be useful interpreting the Bible. Another helpful way to kind of understand it and think about it is thinking about something some of you might be more familiar with, would be reading a mystery novel, right? When you're reading a mystery novel, you have to do the same thing, right? There's the whole storyline, there's the whole narrative that you're trying to understand. And then there are the little parts of the narrative, right? Little episodes, little places where there might be some evidence or some hints the author is trying to give you in that mystery novel about, let's say if it's a murder mystery, about who the murderer is. And as you're looking for these little details, as you're looking for these little pieces of evidence, you have to see if they fit the larger narrative, right? For example, you see a piece of evidence that might tell you that a certain person might be the murderer. But when you look at where that piece of evidence comes from, you recognize that it doesn't fit the timeline of the story, right? That's going from the parts to the whole, right? The other idea with the hermeneutic circle traditionally is that you can't look outside the text to understand it, to interpret it correctly. Certainly that's the case with a murder mystery, right? You're not going to find the answer of who committed a murder in a murder mystery by looking at some other text. You've got to stay within that text itself. It's a self-enclosed kind of unit system of meanings and of understandings. And again, you see the same thing with the Bible too, right? You have to stay within the Bible with the text to understand it. To understand one part of the Bible, you have to look at the other parts. You have to look at the overall meaning, etc. Right? This is a fundamental idea of hermeneutics. And again, I want to emphasize with you. So you might want to, if you just Google hermeneutics and then just to get a quick idea of the traditions and where they developed it, et cetera, if you're interested in that. Um, the Wikipedia page for that is Wikipedia sometimes is a good place to at least to start to look at something like this, and you'll see the different versions of hermeneutics and the hermeneutic circle, et cetera. But again, it's very important for biblical interpretation. The last thing I wanted to share with you here are some of the important issues in terms of the Bible historically that relate to issues of gender in the Bible. Clearly, historically, a lot of the ways in cultures where the Bible, and that's both the Old Testament as being shared across a number of different religions, and then also again we'll read the New Testament, which we identify more with Christianity. Well, you'll see in which those texts have influenced our understanding, our ideas about gender. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this because some of the discussion questions that are due Monday will have you thinking a little bit about gender and sexuality and gender roles, etc. Certainly, some of the ideas of gender roles that developed in a lot of Western cultures you can see tied to the Old Testament and again with Christian traditions with the New Testament. But we'll focus here on the Old Testament, obviously. You trace that all the way back, obviously, to the creation story, right? One of the things that I should mention here is that there are people who promote traditional gender roles, as well as people who promote more progressive gender roles, who have both looked to certain places in the Bible to support their views. So I don't want to be read here necessarily as claiming that the Bible only supports very traditional views of gender and gender roles. That's something that's up to you to determine and decide for yourself. And you can read different texts that talk about gender roles, the origins of gender roles, the Bible, and again, different ways of looking at those, interpreting the Bible in terms of gender roles. Now, historically, it's certainly been the case that the people in the church who had the power, the people in the church who were the church officials, and again, the best example that I can give here is the Catholic Church, because we know that the Catholic Church has been very patriarchal historically, and that's been gradually changing in the last 10, 20 years, and some pretty significant changes in terms of who can be church officials and who can interpret the Bible for people, et cetera. But traditionally, it was certainly the case that they were males, right? And probably were naturally going to interpret the Bible in a way that maintained that patriarchal structure, right? Where the authority would be with males. You can see that in Augustine. You can see that in, we're going to be reading some of Romans, and you'll be able to see that there, as well. And interpretations of the Bible that kind of reinforce this idea, that kind of a patriarchal view of gender roles, right? Some people might argue that that's because those things are a part of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some people might argue that they're not, again, the Bible can be interpreted in other ways, and that what you're seeing there is more interpretations by males in the church who, again, wanted to maintain that patriarchy. So again, really a lot of complexity here, different viewpoints, different arguments and issues, and this has been obviously ongoing and probably will continue well into the future. But some of the ideas that certainly have been influential, right? When we go to the creation story, we have Adam being created first, right? That's something people historically have pointed to and saying that and promoting a kind of a patriarchal view of the power structure and the differences between men and women. Eve being created second as a companion for Adam. Had Adam been not been lonely, maybe Eve would not have been created. Again, it all depends on how you kind of interpret the Bible. We have Adam coming directly from God, whereas Eve was created from Adam's rib, right, in the Old Testament. So there's an idea here. I popped up on the screen, the sons of God and the daughters of men. You'll see those phrases used in several places in the Bible, where again, man came directly from God in the form of Adam, whereas Eve came from Adam's rib. Again, reinforcing that kind of a patriarchal sort of perspective. It also suggests the idea of men being identified more with mind as it relates to spirituality, as it relates to intellect, women being identified more again with the body and with sexuality. You'll see that a lot in Romans. You'll see it quite a number of places in Romans where there is kind of a new version of the Platonic desire to escape the body and just be a disembodied spirit. Very strong Platonic kind of emphasis there in Romans that we'll talk about. But those have been very important and very influential over time as well, too, right? We have the idea of the serpent going to Eve rather than Adam because Eve was easier to seduce. And then that being tied again with emotions, with bodily desire, etc., whereas man is related to intellect, rationality, logic, the mind, all those kinds of things. And I'm just talking about those because you'll see how those have manifested themselves over time in Western culture in different traditions. Some of those traditions, again, we'll see in some of the future readings that we'll be doing. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, and so you can see where those kind of things are coming from. But again, there are people that point to other places in the Bible to challenge some of that patriarchy and challenge some of those traditional gender roles as well. Or just again, as people have argued that there isn't just one way to interpret the Bible. There are other kinds of interpretations, and some interpretations will not lead to the same kind of patriarchal perspective that the traditional interpretation might lead to, etc. So again, you can look at things through that lens too. But I just wanted to talk about that because again, it will be in some of the discussion questions for Genesis and Exodus that are due on Monday. So just as a reminder for that. For Wednesday's class, we're going to be talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I know I briefly mentioned previously, Gilgamesh is a story that has a lot of interesting parallels with things in the Old Testament. And we'll be focusing on the flood story aspect of this. It's Sumerian, ancient Sumerian. It's from way, way before the Bible. It predates the Bible by hundreds of years. This called the Epic of Gilgamesh, about this character Gilgamesh, who is half human, half God. He feels caught between the two worlds, and is and feeling like he doesn't belong in either place. And in this epic, he is seeking to become immortal and trying to figure out how can he find immortality. He does have a human friend that he identifies with a certain degree, but he's different. This human friend dies, etc. And in talking about how to achieve immortality, you'll see that there's this version of the flood story from this one individual who was immortal, was actually supposed to die in the flood, but one of the gods told him to build an ark and gives him the dimensions for the ark. And that part of the story in particular sounds exactly like what you read in the Old Testament about Noah being told to build this ark. Except in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it was one of the gods who kind of on the sly told this one character in the story to create this ark, and that he would be saved if he did so. And he does, and he survives. And the other gods become angry because they wanted to kill all the human beings because they just disliked them. They made too much noise and other kinds of things. But because this one character survives, and his name's Utnapishtim, we'll talk about Utnapishtim when we talk about Gilgamesh. Because he survives, he has to become immortal. Because all the mortals were supposed to be killed in this flood. And so Gilgamesh wants to find this Utnapishtim to find out how he can also become immortal. The story at the Epic of Gilgamesh was written on a series of clay tablets, or I should say they're probably stone tablets, excuse me. Some of which have survived, some of which haven't survived. What I have made available to you in the Gilgamesh file is the text that was taken from the existing tablets of the story of Gilgamesh. We're just going to focus on number 11 because that has the flood story in it specifically. But I'm going to do a lecture on this on Wednesday, and I'm going to give you some more specifics about the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story and what happens in it. I just gave you a real basic outline there. But I'm going to have you read just tablet 11. If you want to read the other tablets, that's fine, or just parts of them, that's fine. But the only required reading is going to be tablet number 11, which again will focus on specifically on the story of the flood. You'll see other things that seem similar to the Bible. The number 7 recurs in a number of places. That's similar to the Bible. Other kinds of things here. So I just wanted to also tell you a little bit about that in preparation for Wednesday's reading. I may also mention this on my lecture for Wednesday, but if you get on YouTube, you can find all kinds of kind of home movie or maybe film student movie versions of Gilgamesh. Some of them are really interesting. Some of them are funny. There's some animated versions, things that people obviously did for school projects, some for film school, some probably just for a humanities class or something, or as a senior project or something like that, that are kind of interesting. You might just want to look at some of those briefly. Some of those are pretty entertaining because the story has some kind of outlandish sort of elements to it. But that's it for my Old Testament lecture. Hopefully that'll help for the discussion questions that are due on Monday. I did send new groups through a Canvas announcement. If you got that announcement in time before you did the discussion questions, use the new discussion groups. If you didn't, you can still use the old ones just for Monday and then switch over. And for my lecture on Wednesday, I might talk a little bit about some of those discussion questions, Again, I'll be sending out the student responses with some of my own comments to those discussion questions that are due Monday, but also on Wednesday, I'll kind of focus on that story of Gilgamesh, and you'll be reading tablet number 11 for that. So I hope you have enjoyed the rest of your weekend, and I hope you find this lecture helpful with the discussion questions for the Old Testament.